Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again. I am the Economancer, the High Priest of the Economicon, and today we're going to be talking about why American education is broken. So, before we continue, I want to give you an introduction to myself. If you're liking the direction of this channel and you like a lot of the arguments that I'm trying to present from a conservative perspective in sociology and economics, I implore you to like, share, subscribe. Even if you don't agree with me, get it out there to people who may disagree with me. Have them come in, rebut me. They can get on video. We can do a debate, or they can, make fun of me in the comments. Whatever you want to do, that's fine by me. But I think that this opinion ought to be heard, and I think it's something that should be shared, and I'm not PragerU, so it's at least good. So this video comes from the Gravel Institute, or as I like to think of them as Gravel Institute, because their name spells gravel. And listening to them makes me want to run my face across gravel. That being said, there's something I'm going to point out here. Typically, they are really, really good at having citations in their work, but in this video, they do not. And I can't imagine why. I looked up a lot of it. I'm trying to break some of it down, open some of it up. I will have my citations, which I'll just give you the websites more so than the citations. You can just follow them and look at them as you want. I've only pulled some of the information from them because there's a lot that goes into it, but I highlight most of the points. But yeah, so let's jump into this.
For decades, we've heard politicians and the media lambast public schools as failing and broken and denounce the corrupt teachers' unions for protecting lazy and bad teachers. If you look at the statistics, that appears to be the case. You see a story of declining test scores and mediocre student performance. In 2018, the United States performed worse than Lithuania and Vietnam in mathematics on international testing. The antidote prescribed by the establishment experts is simple: privatization and deregulation. But what if they're wrong? What if the root causes plaguing our public schools are instead poverty, hypersegregation, and chronic disinvestment? What if we examine public schools not as isolated institutions, but within a larger political and economic context that deprives children, families, and their communities of basic livelihoods? In the late 1980s, renowned writer Jonathan Kozol barnstormed the country for 2 years.
All right, we're going to take a pause there. There's a lot to open up. So first and foremost, if you think that those are the issues at hand, I don't know why you can't point to why privatization and deregulation wouldn't solve those problems. In debate, we call this solvency. Those can be solved by privatization and deregulation. So therefore, we should go with that unless told otherwise. Why not? Which he doesn't make an argument against that. He just makes an argument against, the status quo as it is. All right, so we start off with this idea like, look at the statistics. This appears to be the case, but here comes the but. And I hate when people do this. Don't even give in to the statistics. Why? If you know that they're wrong, don't even portray them as proper. Ignore them. Anyway, that's just a problem of debate tactics with this individual. Okay, so America performed worse than others in mathematics on international testing. So again, there's no citation for this, but I looked it up. So first, this measurement starts from 2000. Now, just so we're clear, the United States has shown no significant changes in results. And now this includes that the United States has continuously moved upward in both reading and science in the rankings. We've kind of stayed pretty much the same. We've moved from 32 to 30 in mathematics. The U.S. is historically underperformed in math, but we've typically performed in the top 10 in science and reading, depending on the year. And most of that has to do with the rest of the world getting worse at education, not the U.S. getting better at education. Of those countries, only 7 of those countries actually moved in any significant direction, up or down. And those were 7 developing countries that did much, much better at bringing about education to their population. So yeah, this isn't just an America problem. It seems like it's pretty much where it's at for the past 30 years across almost all countries. So, yeah, I don't know. This is just a cherry pick statistic. I don't know why you didn't bring up how well we do in science and reading. Okay, so then we get into this again, this privatization and deregulation by the experts. Again, they're the experts. Why don't you attack some of their arguments rather than making an emotional ploy, which is what this entire set of argumentation is. So we've got these things: poverty, hyper segregation, and disinvestment. So first, poverty. Poverty is bad, doesn't matter where it's at, but we have to look at relative poverty measures. The United States, when it comes to relative poverty measures, isn't actually that bad. It's probably better than 99% of the world by countries, right? Hypersegregation. I'm pretty sure this is everyone's first time hearing this term. This is a sociological term. So it's for segregation, right? Obviously, but it's rather broad. It's an index of 5 different factors. And they're typically associated with the spatial concentration of racial groups within an area. But the problem is there's not a whole lot of analysis in the causal mechanism for hypersegregation, because you can look at some of the things such as like historical trends in segregation, as well as historical trends in loans and stuff like that. But that doesn't necessarily give you the full picture. It may give you some of the components, it may give you some of the factors, but it doesn't give you the full picture, because it also doesn't introduce whether or not minority groups choose to stay within group versus without group, which is something that Dr. Thomas Sowell has looked into, and he's stated that there's a strong within group feeling in a lot of these areas, and that's one of the reasons why there's a lack of mobility, because there was a great mass mobility from the south into the north, specifically the Rust Belt, places like Detroit and stuff like that. But once they got there, they didn't. And that's just like a cultural thing. And the next thing to think about in this is social disorganization theory, which there's a great amount of research in social disorganization theory. And basically it says that the isolation of minority in groups comes from not only the segregation that they feel from these out groups, but it's also from the flight of the middle and upper class minorities. And that concentrates the poverty, and it reduces the social control mechanisms that inhibit poor behavior. So if we're looking at this from a totality perspective, then there's also a problem of, minority groups staying in these areas once they come to a certain level. I've seen this in a few places. This is anecdotal. Individuals have said, once I got out, I never wanted to go back. I want nothing to do with that anymore. But what that does is it concentrates all of those bad actions. So the people who do make it, they leave, and that starts creating this lack of latent pattern maintenance that we've talked about from the agile system, and it also causes problems in this collective efficacy that we've talked about from time to time. And so those are some big factors that's not being taken into account here. And another thing to think about this hypersegregation, right? So hypersegregation fell from 33% to 22% during those years that the scores were assessed, and yet no improvements were made in education. And this concentration that's going on now is becoming a clustering phenomenon. So it's not representative of the Black experience, but it represents a subset of metropolitan areas that's having these problems. But by and large, in the United States, it's not that significant of an issue. If you remove yourself from these metropolitan areas, you're not going to have that much of a problem. But again, we have clustering that happens in these major metropolitan areas, and that's an issue. And we don't know how to deal with it in reality, because there's a lot of benefits to clustering that I'm sure you've heard me talk about in some of my regional economics works that I've done with, the NyQuil economists and stuff like that. Clustering has many benefits, but it also has downsides and drawbacks. And this is something that Gunnar Myrdal had talked about, as well as several other economists looking at what's called cumulative causation and unbalanced or balanced growth paths. Anyway, let's get on with it, because there's just way too much to crack open on that one.
visiting and documenting his observations in schools in urban and suburban neighborhoods. Reporting from East St. Louis, he noted in his harrowing book, Savage Inequalities, that schools were overcrowded. Children did not have sufficient books, paper, computers, and other resources. Science labs were outdated by a half century. And improper heating made some classrooms freeze and others boil, sometimes reaching 100 degrees. As Kozel put it, one searches for some way to understand why a society as rich and frequently as generous as ours would leave these children in their penury and squalor for so long, and with so little public indignation. Contrary to popular belief, more than a quarter century later, public schools across the United States remain starved of resources. That's because the US is unique in how it funds schools. School funding is determined largely by local property taxes, meaning that wealthy, largely white children are educated in gleaming palaces, while poor, Black, Latino, and Indigenous children are often confined to crumbling schools with crowded classrooms, zero-tolerance discipline, poorly paid teachers and staff, and lack of access to school nurses, librarians, and social workers. Consider a tale of...
All right, before we get into considering the tale, let's talk about that. All right. So first off, he says that they're funded a certain way. Most of the funding does come from that, but you can make up lacking of funding from your local property taxes by your state and federal government. Both of them do help pay into schools. But there are certain things that you have to meet. They're not going to pay for your school if it's failing, which he gets into that, but but they do help pay for it. So it's not just strictly on the property taxes. So he's taking that to the extreme and not extrapolating back from it. All right. So first of all, the best response that comes to this is empirical evidence. So in the book, No Excuses, Abigail and Stefan Thernstrom showed that in urban New Jersey, the financial inequities were largely gone by, the year 2000 and 2001. But the differences in school outcomes remained static. So obviously this isn't the only metric, but one would assume based on, his arguments that there would be some measure of improvement over this time if there became less inequity. Or is it strictly like a relative level of inequity? Because that's something that Kozel has talked about, is that it's not that there is inequity, it's that there's relative inequity, whatever that means. Now, another thing, I know some of those stories sound harrowing and terrible, but there's two things you have to take into account. One, this is a sampling bias. So he's going to go to the worst places. Two, he's going to pull and specifically choose the worst stories imaginable, as they are more emotionally powerful than just normal stories. So this is not entirely representative of all of these places, and it's definitely not representative of education within the United States. All right, so he goes on to say that, they're starved for resources, but money spent on education has doubled in the last 30 years since the writing of Howard Kozel. Yet we've seen no marked improvements. And again, this goes back to his rebuttal was, well, it's relative. Well, how is there not a change in absolute difference if there's been a change in the absolute amount of money that's been spent? That doesn't make any sense. You can't just say, well, just because they're rich, even though it goes from 5,000 to 10,000, but they go from 7,000 to 11,000, that there is no change in these statistics, right? That doesn't make any sense. There has to be some change that can be noticed. Also, there's no citation for the Latin or indigenous populations. So to think about this, there's only 2 cities that have hypersegregation for Latin students, and no are known for First Nations. So again, I don't get how this is getting tossed into there within that first statement of what he's pointing at, the disinvestment, disinvestment, hypersegregation, and anyway. Anyway, I lost track. So all I'm saying is that you would assume that there would be some changes. Anyway, the next part about this that gets really strange is that he treats these minority groups as they're just some singular homogenous outgroup. It's just saying, well, they're not white, therefore they are burdened. And I think that's gross. And he consistently maneuvers around the fact of Asians. As you can tell, he said, well, mostly white, but in fact, the largest representative of the middle class, by per capita standards of their own racial makeup, is Asians. So again, it sounds crazy, but at the end of the day, he's really trying to skirt around several different topics without doing any level of analysis. And the last thing I want to talk about here is this zero tolerance policy. Zero tolerance policy is made for children, kids, young adults, teenagers who are in school who cannot learn because of the problems that are associated with being at school. You know, he wants to talk about the moral indignation of individuals having to have children sit here in these poorly constructed rooms where it's too hot or too cold. Imagine being a student and trying to learn, where you're not just hungry, but you're also hungry and you have to deal with someone over here fist fighting in the middle of the class or constantly talking back to the teacher or being loud. That's why we have zero tolerance policies, because we cannot afford to lose the level of education for a classroom of students because one student wants to act poorly. Just flat out, that's where that came from. Has it been entirely useful? No. Has it had specifically bad effects? Sure. But that's not something that you can do. It's not something you can generally look at without looking at the other factors that are going on there.
Two school systems. In rich, predominantly white Lower Merion, a suburb of Philadelphia, schools spend more than $26,000 per student. And just a few miles away, the diverse Philadelphia schools, which serve predominantly poor and working class children, spend less than $15,000 per student. This is a nationwide phenomenon. In 2016, majority minority.
I just want to point this out. North Carolina has a little bit better, if I'm not mistaken, outcomes when it comes to students. When it comes to like the going into college level. So we're number 15 in that, but number 30 in overall education. I'll get into that statistic here in a minute. But we spend far less than the poor kids. Spend $9,000 roughly per child. So that's something to think about. But again, it's not the number, because the number can keep going up and the responses don't change. There's something else there.
Minority school districts receive $23 billion less in funding than majority white districts, despite serving the same number of students. This is apartheid-style education. Instead of addressing these inequities, the federal government has doubled down on a market-based approach. Private foundations, think tanks, and both Democratic and Republican officials have fought for a corporate makeover of the public education system. They champion austerity measures, high-stakes standardized testing, school closures, expansion of no-excuses charter schools, a weakening of teachers' unions, and stiff disciplinary.
There was that shot at the book that I was telling you about. What a refutation.
Methods. This has been the major approach of education reform for the last 2 decades. In 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act, signed into law by President George Bush, with bipartisan approval, imposed stringent testing measures for elementary and middle school students. Those schools that didn't make adequate annual progress risked being labeled as a failing school, having all or parts of its staff fired, shut down, converted into a charter school, taken over by the state, or privatized. Then there.
Okay, before I get into the rest of this section, because this is a really long section, and I'm sure you don't want to hear him nearly as much as you want to hear me. Okay, so $23 billion less in funding despite the same number of students. That sounds crazy, but it's not. Okay, it's also not representative of all states or many of the areas in the United States. But let's ask a question. We can look at a relatively purple state that's had economic issues as well as social mobility issues historically. North Carolina is ranked roughly 30th in the U.S. in education, but there is more money spent per non-white poor student than there is on rich white student, and way more than on poor white student, which is the lowest per capita. So obviously there's something that's not entirely correct here. There are other factors that need to be taken into account. And also when he says this $23 billion, man, and he gives you this really bad Philadelphia, he's pointing to the worst and giving you this grand number. So it makes you feel really bad. But the actual disparity is roughly $2,000 per student across the United States. Many of the places are roughly equal, but obviously if you're doing the average, it's going to have the outliers play a large role in it. And so he uses this 23 billion because it just invokes this much larger disparity, but it's actually not when you think of the entirety of the spending. And then you also think that many of the states that he pulled from, because I actually found what he was looking at, there wasn't any differences between the two because they couldn't find a high enough concentration in these places on predominantly black or Latinx or, minority schools versus predominantly white schools. So they had to find in this 75% or more, which isn't representative of many of the states of America. So again, there's another one of those sampling biases. Also, the No Child Left Behind Act, again, this was set for a level of motivation to move through so that we could do better. Because if you have a failing system, there's no reason to try to put band-aids on it or prop it up. It's best to just come in with something new. Even if it's only a short-term gain, it'll be something that's better than what it was. You don't ride a bike with a flat tire, because the more you ride it, the more you warp that rim.
There was the Race to the Top program, a $4 billion grant competition under the Obama administration. In order to qualify for federal education funding, states were required to adopt an ensemble of policies in their schools: performance-based teacher evaluations, more standardized tests, more charter schools, and more interventions in failing schools, closures, privatizations, and takeovers. Under the logic of the school reformers, superintendents get called CEOs. Schools in poor communities, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous ones, are ranked, sanctioned, shut down, and turned over to private management based on student test scores. Teachers are fired and punished based on student performance, and their ratings are sometimes published in newspapers. Segregated charter schools are opened to create an educational free market to promote competition with public schools. In New York City alone, more than 100,000 students, or 1 in 10 in the city, were homeless. About 34,000 of them came to school from homeless shelters. Millions more children across the US, about 15% of all children, live in poverty. It is one of the highest rates in the industrialized world. That rate is far above the 4% figure in Scandinavian countries. Former Secretary of Education Arne Duncan once said that it is...
Okay, before we get into that, so let's talk about something really quick. All right, first of all, he makes a shot at, this privatization. Look at all these people. They're trying to make everything run like a business and stuff like that. And then he takes a shot at that. And he takes a shot at them being called CEOs and stuff, right? But that's a shot at Chicago, which, if you didn't know, Chicago is the fastest growing school district with respect to doing better. It is actually one of the few school districts that is actually improving over time. There are numerous citations that I have down there below. You should look at them and you should see that a lot of the things that he's pointing out at, going, oh, this is bad, this is bad. These are things that Chicago, right? Chicago has started implementing, and they've had great success. So if you can take one of the most violent places in America and make these changes that he's dogmatically attacking and yet have better outcomes. Why would I listen to you? What makes sense here? The empirical evidence saying that a lot of these changes, these market-driven based changes and stuff like that that have been implemented into Chicago have made these very big differences in the level of education. It's, I think they're in the 96th percentile. I think they have a graduation rate of 88%. I think they have a college education rate of something like 60%, give or take. It's working. And their superintendent calls herself a CEO. So when he said that, just know that he's taking a shot at things that are actually improving in people's lives. In the next, he talks about this problem of, food, of malnourishment in the United States and obesity, right? But the problem with the malnourishment, the problem of was being poor, the problem of these homeless, all of these aren't fixed by the education system. These are other avenues of issues that we can all agree with, but that doesn't mean that whatever's happening in the school system necessarily causes those or have any feedback problems. Those can happen for a plethora of reasons, and pointing to them doesn't fix anything. And it's not even an argument. He's just, look at all the bad things. And education. There's no connection.
Opportunity, not poverty, that shapes children's destiny. But we know the effects of poverty on children: malnutrition, stunted development, mental illness, and low academic achievement.
All right, so this is where I'm actually going to stop it. Okay, so again, there's not a single citation on malnutrition being caused by poverty. Right, so the single most prevalent form of malnutrition in the United States is obesity. And though some researchers have pointed to food insecurity and the cheapness of fast food as the reasons behind this, the reality is that depending on the area, more often than not, healthy foods are cheaper, sometimes up to 2 times less expensive. But the conversation people don't want to have is that this comes down to poor choices and addictions. This fast food is highly addictive. Being obese is an addictive response. It is a behavioral response to something that's negative on the inside, 9 times out of 10. And it's something that we need to deal with as a country. Absolutely. But that ain't it, Chief. It ain't poverty. All right. So mental illness. Now, this becomes an endogenous problem because there might be some bidirectional causality, and that poverty may be a consequence of poor mental health. So if you have poor mental health, you're going to live in poverty, right? So if we look at this differs from country to country on, whether mental illness is actually associated with inequality or poverty, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is. In the United States, I don't know very much in the literature that says it is. A lot of the literature points to inequality, this relative absolute differences in inequality, this subjective economic status we've talked about numerous times. That's typically what's used. That's typically what we consider consequences when we think about this poor mental health structures. From the structures point of view, I mean, even from the critical point of view, but looking at poverty and just going, oh, look what poverty causes, I don't think there's very much evidence on that, because there may be places that poverty does cause those problems. Those may be a problem of the aesthetic, right? So it's not that you're poor, it's that you're poor in a place that has terrible aesthetics. I don't know if you've seen the meme. It's just like, it doesn't matter how bad my life gets, I can always walk outside. And you got, the rural poor person in America. They walk outside, they're in woods or farms or something like that. And then they show you a picture of someone over in Eastern Europe, and they're poor, and they walk outside, and all they just see is gray, just gross gray, and it looks depressing. So that might be a problem that's associated with poverty in the United States, but that doesn't mean that it is poverty. It's something that's to do with the aesthetic. It's something to do with the different structures around them. All of this has to be taken into account. And then also think about this for an example, right? If we look at suicidality in the United States, this casts a different glance on how we see poor mental health. So the highest rates are First Nations. So that's a big issue, but it's followed by whites. So maybe poverty has an impact, but the response is heterogeneous when it comes to this issue about the possible comorbidity between mental illness and your subjective socioeconomic status or your absolute socioeconomic status. And then we're going to look at this low academic achievement. Again, this is an endogeneity problem. Because first of all, this is what the whole conversation's about: is poverty causes low academic achievement, therefore the scourge of poverty causes these things, therefore we need money, right? So you're kind of building your case poorly here, in my opinion. But anyway, the problem becomes, in this endogeneity structure, there might be a reason why your parents were poor. That might also affect your ability to achieve academically. That may not have anything to do with your level of intelligence. Let's just throw out IQ. Don't even care about it. It may be personality disposition. It may be that you have very bad parents. That's something that no one wants to talk about. You can have very bad parents that will affect you. You are poor because you have very bad parents. You don't get to do very much in school because you have bad parents. They keep you up at night. They're arguing all the time. All of these issues, anger, violence, all of these are not being taken into account by just saying it is poverty. It is not poverty. It can be, but it's more than likely something to do with your environment that has nothing to do with poverty. The poverty is caused by the problems that's in the environment, such as your parents.
If the corporate school reformers were really committed to making life better for the poorest children in our country, they would stop making such asinine comments and declare, as educator Kenzo Shibata once said, poverty shouldn't be, period. It's not...
I gotta stop you right there. Okay, poverty shouldn't be. Sure, murder shouldn't be. Addiction shouldn't be. Anything bad in this world shouldn't be. But they are. And to suppose otherwise, to think that we can just... poverty's gone. That's a nirvana fallacy. Keep thinking of heaven while on earth. But don't think earth will be heaven.
Actually that hard to imagine what is necessary to transform the lives of the most vulnerable. It doesn't require more charter schools or more standardized testing. Rather, in line with other countries, we could guarantee an unconditional sum of $250 a month per child per family to pay for diapers, food, clothing, and other childcare costs. This measure alone would cut the child poverty rate by 40% and slash deep poverty in half. It would be the most substantive expansion of the social safety net for children in the modern history of the United States. If we are to guarantee...
Sure, but we already have substantial amounts of social welfare for children and mothers. Come on. You're saying you're going to give them $250. That's all you're going to do. You're just going to give them $250. And then what? All those bad things that led to the problems just go away, except for the bad things caused by the spending problems? Giving money doesn't solve the world's problems, neither materially or idealistically. If the food purchased is still poor quality, then you're still going to have malnutrition no matter how much money you give them. Buying diapers, is this meant to expose me to some emotional plea about a baby? There are tons of programs out there from mothers in place as is to help with these burdens. Why do you think your additional $250 a month per child is somehow going to make this grand difference? I don't buy it. I don't think just handing mom $250 makes a difference. Stop giving mom money. I don't understand this. We've had this significant problem in the United States with single marriage and all of the other issues associated with it. We've had a collapse of the nuclear family, and we've had a complete collapse of masculinity. And yet we still want to give people money to make bad choices. We need to stop socializing all of the risk. At some point, we have to understand that people do bad things. People make poor choices. Should we help them? Absolutely. You should help them. But you should also know that if we're going to help you, there are certain criteria that have to be met. There are certain things that you have to do. You can't just give people things constantly and just hope magically the world gets better. It doesn't work like that. It has never worked like that. No outcome can you look at and go, well, they just kept giving them money and it got better. Never happened. Ever.
Guarantee an equitable public education, worthy of the dignity of all children. There is no better place to begin than waging an assault on the moral scandal of child poverty in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. I'm Nikhil Goyal, sociologist and PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge for the Gravel Institute.
Okay, so that's the end of it. He goes on an emotional tirade, lambasting his morality at everyone, and if you disagree, you're obviously immoral. But I'm going to tell you now, I absolutely reject your moral position. I say if you want a better education in the United States, then we need to remove poor performing teachers and ideologues who constantly squeeze out actual education in favor of biased nonsense. Stop teaching children social studies and humanities, all of that. Let's bring on a golden age of education by implementing these Schopenhauer reforms. In my opinion, I think it would be far more beneficial to teach children logic, mathematics, and reading all the way up until they are in high school. Do not teach them anything that's just your own personal positional ideology. Let them learn the basis for all of these issues, right? That would make more sense to me. Let them learn how to think. Then give them the information that way they can look at it critically. I don't want my child to go in there and be inculcated or indoctrinated in whatever political party is in power. And I don't just mean power in the sense of those who are voted. I also mean power as in who is controlling the discourses. And as we can see, the monumental failure of education can be pointed at by who's controlled the discourses in education for 30 years, which has been the left. So I don't want my child being inculcated and indoctrinated in right-wing nonsense, left-wing nonsense. I don't want none of that in my schools. What I want my children to learn is logic, how to think, what it means to think, mathematics, how to do mathematics. I don't care how you teach it. I personally like Common Core mathematics. And then reading. Teach them how to read. Don't teach them what they're supposed to be reading. Don't teach them the meaning behind everything. Let them find that themselves. I think that would be the most beneficial, because I think critical thinking, and I don't mean critical in the Frankfurt School, I mean critical as in being able to establish cost-benefit ratios, looking at things logically, establishing connections, and understanding nuance that happens within every argument. If you want to increase education, then remove all of these barriers to real education, because it does a disservice to people who are actually out there trying to teach children multiple forms, multiple ideas. I hope this has been entertaining. This has been a 40-minute video over a 7-minute video. This is why I don't like Gravel Institute. This is why I don't like PragerU. The level of nuance that goes into these arguments, it cannot be summed up in 5 minutes. I don't care who you are or who you think you are, Mr. PhD at Cambridge University. You got paid to do this. You should be embarrassed to call yourself a researcher while putting out this, 1, without a single citation, 2, without looking into any of these, different statistics that you've pointed at and deriving some other conclusion and then clashing those ideas. And then last, not do any of the research yourself. Nothing. This is sad. This is depressing. And if PragerU did this, I would make fun of them just as much, but it just so happened to be the Gravel Institute. With that, I am the Economancer. I hope you've enjoyed this journey into the Economicon. Have a good one.